risk models for several of the sites and not able to prepare full QRA models for every site. However, in the context of determining suitable planning zones, I consider that we had sufficient data on the risk profile of the Greymouth facilities available from the QRA models that we had prepared to enable us to make those decisions about suitable risk management contours. Within attachment 2 of the rebuttal, the specific 1 by 10 to the minus 6 per year individual risk of fatality contours are presented for the 6 facilities for which the detailed QRA models have been developed. In my view, the previously presented proposed risk management contours for those facilities, i.e. those ones based on the extent of the 5 by 10 to the minus 7 per year individual risk of fatality contour with that distance rounded up, are suitable for inclusion in the proposed district plan. That notwithstanding, the specific 1 by 10 to the minus 6 per year individual risk of fatality contours for these facilities are presented in attachment 2, should council ultimately decide to base the risk management contours on the position of that 1 by 10 to the minus 6 risk contour. My understanding is that Greymouth is now seeking that the contours attached to the rebuttal statement, i.e. those ones based on the 1 by 10 to the minus 6 per year individual risk of fatality, be included in the proposed plan. And just to give some context to the difference between individual risk of fatality criteria of 5 by 10 to the minus 7 per year and 1 by 10 to the minus 6 per year, make reference to the New South Wales Department of Planning risk criteria. This is set out in the publication commonly referred to as HIPAP 4, which describes risk criteria for different types of land use. The types of land use applicable to 5 by 10 to the minus 7 per year individual risk and 1 by 10 to the minus 6 per year individual risk are, for the 5 by 10 to the minus 7, hospitals, schools, child care facilities, old age housing, developments, and so on. We typically refer to them as vulnerable populations or sensitive developments. And the 1 by 10 to the minus 6 is typical residential developments, other places of continuous occupancy, and so on, like hotels or tourist resorts. That's concludes the front end of the rebuttal statement. The rest of it goes on to address specific points made by Ms. Polich.
Thank you, Mr. Dreyer. Now, if you could just make yourself available for any questions from the panel.
With pleasure.
Thank you, Lachlan. What I've gleaned from looking between the mapping and your 5th of August evidence compared to your 19th of August evidence is the moving to the one by a million per year, the actual max extent comes down quite a lot from using the other metric 5 times 10 to the minus 7 per year. I'm just looking, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm looking at the Goldie well site, your figure 1 compared to figure 1 in your rebuttal evidence. Is that what I'm seeing, or is that not quite as simple as that?
The difference in the, I'll just get them up in front of me. What you're seeing, the difference with the Goldie is what the approach we had recommended was that like it makes sense to me from a planning perspective that if there's a buffer around a facility, it should, in broad terms, be extend the similar distance around the complete perimeter. So the extent and what we had done was take the position of the risk contour and then round it up. Now, for most of these facilities, the difference in distance between 5 by 10 to the minus 7 and 1 by 10 to the minus 6 is very, very little. And where we take that and round it up to the nearest 10 meters, in most cases, we end up with the same distance. In the Goldie one, it's what you're seeing is the specific risk contour of the 1 by 10 to the minus 6, which is centered around various key bits of equipment and so on. So that's the specific contour. and what we presented, what I presented earlier, which fundamentally I believe it's a more sound approach, is taking that type of that distance and applying it around the complete facility. So in essence, what you're seeing, the differences between the figures is not the difference between 5 by 10 to the minus 7 and 1 by 10 to the minus 6. It's a difference between rounding it up and putting it around the, essentially putting a box around the complete site, as opposed to, here's a risk contour that sits around a piece of equipment.
So you're recommending to us, or the position I've got from what I've just heard is that the council refers the 1 in a million, 1 to a million provision, and those contours around the facilities are mapped in rebuttal evidence. And is it those purple, the orange lines, are those what you're suggesting go into the district plan as a risk contours now?
Correct.
Based on the suggestion from the council that we use the 1 in a million.
Yes, that's for the mapped URA sites.
URA, so
We've still got the 27
Yes.
comparative report
yes,
sites.
which look at for
Yes,
50 metres or, yeah. Okay. So we can see all of those, it's the orange line, and then the co-fire production station, the 5. We've got the, you can see orange line that you recommend be picked up. In the plan.
that's what we understand
Yes.
council seeking.
So we also have the alternative in the 5th of October, sorry, 5th of August statement, which you'd be equally happy with, or?
Yes, indeed, our risk expert, his evidence is that the 5 times 10 to the minus 7
Yes.
is more appropriate for planning contours going into a map. We accept the council's
Yes.
position, so Greymouth is
Is mapped out.
proposing the 1 in a million contour.
But
In the perimeter model for the comparative site.
No. I think you're asking about applying a perimeter model. Is it the difference in, so it was showing a perimeter model as opposed to.
Correct. Our understanding is that the orange contour is what the council is seeking, so that is what Greymouth is
even
proposing.
though it's less conservative.
Correct.
Can I just clarify one?
Yeah.
When we talk about the 5 by 10 to the minus 7 and the 1 by 10 to the minus 6, in the context of these facilities, the difference in the position of those risk contours is very small. We are talking a couple of meters and so on. So it's, to me, it's not something to be, I guess, debating strongly, you know, should we be basing on 5 by 10 to the minus 7? Should we be based on 1 by 10 to the minus 6? In the context of this, these sites, it's basically, it doesn't matter.
Yes. All right. Understand that. Lachlan, I'm interested in this need for consistency or otherwise with what's occurred at South Taranaki District, which is geographically the next, no, it's 2 districts south from here. Are you familiar with the geography? Have you been here and looked at the wells yourself?
I haven't seen that because of COVID. I wasn't able to travel. I have been across to New Plymouth previously and in the area, but not for a number of years. But I'm not familiar with the detail on the Greymouth sites because I wasn't able to travel through this process.
Yeah.
Our analysis, if where you're going is what's the difference in the nature of the facilities, I can't speak to that because I haven't been working for clients operating well sites in South Taranaki, so I don't have detail on what their particular facilities are like in terms of what I guess the process variables, the process parameters for those facilities and how that then compares to the Greymouth facilities. All I can say is we've spent a lot of time doing the analysis and talking to Greymouth and getting the information right, so that we're very comfortable that what we're what we're presenting in terms of an analysis of potential events and the impacts of those events, we're very comfortable that what we pull forward represents the nature of the Greymouth facilities.
So did you, and this, the answer is not, no, I'm not trying to catch you out here, but did you ever look at the evidence that was presented at that South Taranaki, those South Taranaki hearings by the experts?
Yes, I did. But one of the problems I had was there was the detailed technical information that I would want to be able to join the dots and follow through their complete train of thought was there were gaps in the information available to me. There were gaps in some of that, and so how they came to some of the conclusions. I mean, I can sort of guess at what the process was, but I didn't have access to some of the technical information. Things like when coming up with this 250 for the well sites, it's, well, I presume it's based on a consequence modeling, and that was stated, but the detail and the parameters of what was the exact nature of the well and what did the modeling specifically look like, that wasn't available. So I couldn't do a cross check apart from looking at it and going, that seems a very big number based on everything I know. That's odd based on what I know from these sites.
So I suppose the planning system here in New Zealand, if there's a determined Environment Court decision reasonably recent, a couple of districts down, looking at the same issues, same expert sort of matters at play, you normally take a pretty close guide of that when we're making our decisions. So I don't know whether there's any experts that could fill us in on why the Greymouth wells are different to they're giving us evidence for the well that were being looked at in that case. So you can't really help us with that, can you? Because you haven't looked at those wells.
I was not privy to the information that they fed into that model and so on. But in terms of the way things have been put forward coming out of the South Taranaki plan, it's like I've indicated in some of my evidence areas where the application of some of the risk profile will lead to inconsistencies. I've talked about that in my original evidence, where if you could, we could have two identical facilities with risk contours done by different people, and they would have different planning zones, and that seems strange. That doesn't make sense to me. And there's other aspects of where inconsistence, the proposed approach can lead to, what I would see as nonsensical inconsistencies.
Okay. But Jason,
Possibly a simple explanation. A simple explanation would be to compare. I understand Awanui or the Maui production station would be part of South Taranaki District Council, and at least their original design basis of their production capacity would be in the order of 5 to 6 times the size of what our largest Greymouth facility is, and that on a simplistic basis, then you'd agree, Lachlan, the actual throughput has a contribution to the, how much potential flammable material or whatnot that could be released. And so that could explain why in the South Taranaki, larger facilities, larger capacities, and therefore larger consequence distances.
Yep.
Yeah. I think
that's not sure whether any of the staff, Hamish, were you involved as a planner in that? Yes. And Sarah, were you?
Not in the initial works around the well sites, but I certainly was in the environment station process.
I think Karen's told us that there is a different context, different types of wells and scale.
And production stations, LPG played a big.
Yep.
Yeah, that would be important as well. We don't process or store any LPG, but is a slightly different hazardous substance. And Lachlan, you would agree, LPG sort of is the other contributor that can create larger distances.
Certainly, and we were able to establish that that 650-meter separation distance that was the generic distance proposed for production stations was based on a levy of a certain quantity of LPG. And the difference, the facilities that for Greymouth that we've looked at that get captured under this bucket of production stations, they don't have storage inventories of LPG, and so that incident that the 650 meters is based on is not relevant to these particular Greymouth facilities.
College was also involved as a technical expert through the full Environment Court hearing process for South Taranaki. So I expect you'll ask her that same question shortly.
Yes, I will. So look, that's interesting. The other question I had for you, Lachlan, was around the standards and how the methodologies, I suppose. You're following a New South Wales process or standard. Can you tell me more about that?
When you say that, you mean, I mean, I've made reference to the risk criteria, but in terms of
Risk criteria.
the risk criteria, yeah, well, that's what I'd reference in that. But to be honest, our starting point was the council's reference to 1 in a million. I don't have a problem with that as a suitable value. It fits in.
Yes.
It's the normal type of range for that type of purpose. What we had sought to do was, and because when we do a risk assessment and a QRA, there's always arguments about, oh, is this conservative enough? And there's some of these comments being made by Ms. Pollard and so on. Is it conservative enough? So we've gone, all right, let's try and cut off some of these arguments about is it conservative enough? We'll just drop the criteria down a notch. And that'll build in some conservatism, and hopefully we don't have a debate about have we got enough conservatism for these purposes. So that's all we sought to do with that. We were trying to just cut off some future arguments.
Yes. Right. So the other question, and forgive me because I wasn't at hearing 12. I'm the chair of the overall panel, so catching up with it. The modelling that risk experts do you use a standard modelling approach, or is there arguments about different models and approaches as well?
Look, there will be different models and slightly different approaches, but most of us use the same software. So the one produced by DNV, FAST or Safety, depending which way they call it. So most of us are using that, but obviously you can have different inputs and different assumptions in the way you do it. When we conduct a peer review, what we're looking to do is there will be difference. Everyone does it slightly differently, and that's not a problem. What we're looking to do when we do a peer review is there anything in the assessment or in the assumptions that will make a material difference to the risk profile, and that's what we're looking for. So you just step through it like that. The principles and the approaches we all follow are pretty much the same. We all do the same sort of stuff, but there will be subtleties about different assumptions that we make.
Yes, but the assumptions, I'm very familiar with modelling reports in the air discharge, like with the models seem to use the same models that are accepted. Certainly in terms of underground geothermal modelling, seems to be sort of standard methodologies and peer reviewers. But there's no disagreement on the sort of model that you'd run to a QRA.
No, short answer should be no.
The data you're running through should pop out reasonably close when you're doing these processes.
And yes, and one thing to keep in mind at all, like a QRA is quite a blunt instrument. We can do a lot of analysis to build a QRA model, and we can then go and do a hell of a lot more and try to refine the model further, and the risk contour will barely move. You quite often need to have some significant things changed or altered or added to your model to make the risk contour move. So we try not to get too hung up on it, because you can spend a lot of time sort of finessing for basically not much benefit.
So for planning purposes, you're confident that with enough conservative assumptions, getting something in a district plan that's reasonable with the appropriate level of conservatism is appropriate, because we just want to identify general areas of risk.
Absolutely. I mean, we had done some other further analysis on some of the sites, but it wasn't in a state that we could we'd publish it. But for some of these other well sites where we've actually been able to do a little bit more, and the actual risk contours sit comfortably within our what we had proposed as the risk management zone. So we're very comfortable that what we proposed for the sites where we weren't able to do QRAs, we're very comfortable with what's been proposed. Captures the 1 in a million risk contour sits comfortably inside that.
Up in those. So that's we can be confident in your evidence that you've done a sensitivity check that the outer boundaries of those areas that you're suggesting that you haven't done the detailed work on, the risk contours fall comfortably within each of those areas.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of where we, as I said, we didn't get all the way through it, but we've sort of got some, I'll refer to them as draft models that gives us very strong confidence that those proposed distances are suitable, and that the 1 in a million risk contour sits inside that by a fair margin.
Okay, thank you for that advice. I know Dave is listening in. He was on hearing 12, and I've been following all of the evidence and what's required and the legal opinions, and I help with some of the minutes and things. So I'm for another district. So I think I'm comfortable enough myself that I've got enough out of the discussion with Lachlan. But David will obviously be, because if any other further questions, I'm sure.
And we do have Ms. Carville online if there are any questions relating to how the plan could cope with a comparative QRA, for example. There's been some discussions between Ms. Carville and Mr. Resney.
Yes, Jennifer, if you could just respond to that prompt by Karen. You've been discussing through this process as a planning expert, keeping in touch with what's been going on and talking with Hamish. So are you comfortable with the proposition now advanced from a planning perspective?
Yep, that's correct. I have been keeping up to speed, and as you say, had discussions with Hamish. I'm across all of Lachlan's evidence that you've heard today as well. And yes, I think that in terms of my previous evidence and the current position, I'm comfortable that it's appropriate and a reasonable response to use in the district plan. Certainly takes out some of the undue conservatism that would result and have an impact on land use if those arbitrary setbacks were retained.
Okay. Thank you for that. That just provides a continuity through from hearing 12 that you've been involved in looking at this information. And I think we've probably got a pretty good handle on everything now, and it's really about talking on Thursday morning about what we might need to do, if anything, on joint witness statements, and that will be a time and motion study. What can be achieved for what value, given where I'm going to finish off our evidence. But again, as I've said in my email back to everyone on Ms. Hazens, we are minded if there can be some value to some further conferencing. So you've got a plane to catch.
Thank you. I'll see you on the Zoom.
Yes.
I'm able to stay for about 15.
Okay. All right.
Could I?
Yes. Look, I think this perhaps we've finished with the Greymouth team.
Yes.
Come forward to the.
Sorry, I think
think it would be helpful if I started first, although I'm sure Jenny would like to, but I've got the QRA that we are discussing before that was the basis of the 250
Okay.
and my stuff in here. It may be helpful. Yeah. Attachment. Goodness. Those are all attachments. All the same attachment. Yep. Yep. So, and it's mine. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to submit on behalf of Taranaki Energy Watch as our personal submission, obviously. And I take paragraph 1 as read because we're going to repeat who we are, but we'd just like to acknowledge that the reason we want to be involved in this process is that we want to ensure that unacceptable risk is considered appropriately. Because we're part of the community, our members are part of this community. And the first thing that I've provided a summary, I cover off the QRA that supported the agreement with the risk experts. I've actually only put in for this hearing today, but I can supply the register that goes with it. That came about for the 250 metres. I've also put a reference here to the petroleum permit map and Taranaki Explorer maps that are available on the web. It gives information about what is occurring on the well sites. But again, emphasise that the resource consents that are held by the Plymouth District Council are the legal document that describes what can occur on the site over the duration of the consent. These aren't available online and have to be requested. We have some of them. In some sites that are listed in the Greymouth Petroleum list were prior to 1991, so they may not have resource consents.
Just Sarah,
Sorry.
would David have seen this?
He has been emailed a copy.
Oh, okay, that's all good. Yeah, and he's now.
I'm going too fast because I'm still aware of time actually.
Just take your time. We're fine. Yeah.
Okay. So I've tried to put a summary together of the things that we're bringing towards for you, along with Jenny's evidence. We see that the resource consents are required to determine how many wells can be drilled and other equipment at the site. However, Energy Watch understands that the council has a practice of counting sidetrack wells from the same wellhead as one well. So that is one well and two sidetrack wells from the same wellhead is considered to be one well. Now, this has ramifications for considering risk and is not explicit in the resource consents. There's actually no definition provided for well or wellhead in the proposed plan, and I went back and looked at the plan prior, and I went and looked at the Crown Mineral Act, and it doesn't say that either. However, the resource consents themselves refer to wells. While Energy Watch has not been provided with the most recent detailed and generic QRAs in the overall wellhead QRA report, although requested, it is possible to show that the matched well sites and activities do not correspond directly as indicated by Greymouth Petroleum. So that's the three, what I call proxies, I guess. Proxies, I'm not sure it's the right word to use, but a comparison in the wells that it compares with. We bring up that safety cases from WorkSafe indicate that well blowouts are identified as a major accident hazard at all well sites, and that some specific well sites in the safety cases have additional aspects that are identified as major accident hazards. There are some wells that haven't been identified. It's not clear that 20 and 0 metre separation, that's for wells without pipelines and water injection, is appropriate for the identified non-standard well sites without viewing the existing land use rights and or resource consents. And there's been a recent new permit granted for Greymouth Petroleum that includes potentially another existing resource consents for well sites, and that's not clear how that is dealt with if the company decides they want to use them if they are still current. So to look at the QRA that we put there, the first point, this is an attachment at the beginning of attachment A.
Yes.
We don't include the register that goes with it, but we're happy to provide it to Greymouth Petroleum and the hearing commissioners. And this outlines how they came to have 250 metres. I'm afraid it's in black and white, but if you see it digitally, it's a lot more obvious. What that 250 is shown more or less from these, and this is a QRA. So that's where this was actually signed off by Damien. It was one of his funds that he did for Remu Production Station back in 2014. And Damien Phillips and Jenny College were the two experts that determined 250 metres was appropriate. And the parties agreed that this was the case. And I just want to add there that a QRA needs to include all the wells and infrastructure that a well site was consented for, and where a resource consent was buried, then the QRA needs to be buried as well. That the existing well sites in South Taranaki district, the parties agreed that 250 fatality consequence distance would apply, and they didn't seek to take in any QRAs. One of the things that's interesting about this particular document is it shows that well sites across the field, petroleum field, and wells within well sites can have different profiles within themselves as well. Point 4, the petroleum permit maps, Taranaki Explorer and resource consents. The petroleum minerals website provides a publicly available map that documents the permits and other operators' permits in the wells that have been drilled and sidetracked, including location on the site and date by the company. Now, I acknowledge that my understanding is that the District Council used Petroleum and Minerals website to locate these wells. Taranaki Explorer has a publicly available map and references for a number of Taranaki Regional Council resource consents for discharge. It doesn't actually hold the resource consents for land use. And Jenny College brought in 2 examples of well site consents, and they're attached to her documents. So again, I reiterate that it's really important in determining the separation distance that we know how many wells there are. At point 8, I bring up about the drilling of additional sidetrack wells potentially increases the risk, and I think Jenny alludes to this. And I've given you an example for Motor 05 well site, Greymouth Petroleum. It's down by the port. It's in an industrial zone, but it is adjacent to the open zone and near the residential zone. And there were 3 wells drilled there. Consented for. It's got no expiry date on the consent. I've included the consent in here so that you can see it. And 6 wells were drilled from that site. So that was just to give you an example. There are others for other companies as well that have used this procedure. Talking about the detailed QRA equivalents, and this is where we wish to raise the issue that we see around using proxies. Co5B well site is considered as having an equivalent QRA for Uranui A, Ohanga A, Co5 C and D, Homero C, F, G and H, Natura A, B, E, F and G well sites. The separation distances for these have all been established at 50 metres. It's not clear how they determine that these are similar well sites to Co5B in terms of risk. Mr. Dreyhouse states that standard well sites are well sites that correspond directly with one of the well sites analysed in the detailed models. We're not privy to why they chose Co5B well site in particular. However, the earlier QRA presented for Co5B well site dated 22nd of November 2019. Now that was in, I'm just looking to see where I saw it, in the 19th of November 2021 work. Says a drilling workover operation occurs once every 10 years and takes 14 days. Therefore, the equivalent utilisation is 0.38 0.38%. It also states the frequency value is 7 times 10 to the negative 5 for drilled well as shown in table C8. This value has been selected as Greymouth Petroleum indicated that if undertaken, workover activities at the well site is considered to involve drilling activities on existing wells. This workover activities were estimated to occur once in the next 20 years.
Sarah, I wonder,
I'm covering some of what Jenny is doing.
I'm very happy for you to do that, but I just thinking about your question about the Co-5B well site, and why that was chosen to do the detailed assessment.
It's not clear to us,
So
so
I was just going to ask a question to try and make it clear. So, Jason, do you know?
So maybe to give you a wider context, so we chose three well sites. Goldie was kind of, so in our mind, going into the process, Goldie was like a low producer, almost the, try not to, usually try not to go into commercial stuff, but
Yes.
it was almost with a low risk.
Yes.
Profile was deemed as what we thought would be a medium risk, and Tarangi B was sort of say most recent site, the most recent drilling activities to be deemed what we thought would be a high risk well site.
Is that rationale set out in any of the evidence we have?
What Will has, and he's got it stipulated that Goldie's.
Yes.
QRAs, and I think it was comparative QRA.
The reason I'm asking this clarification is that when you're looking at a sample, and scientifically, normal scientific method, you try and look at a range of, the full range, and then if you're going to use those comparisons. So,
That was
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
okay, no, that's all right. So at point 12, I think what I'm trying to emphasize is risk is frequency times consequence. The more often you drill, the higher, the potential for high risk. And what Greymouth Petroleum is indicating here is that workover activities will occur once in the next 20 years. So it's not very often. And so the frequency of drilling workovers has an impact on the fatality risk outcome of the QRA. Energy Watch is wondering if this means the company is agreeable to amend the resource consent to reflect that this drilling program of once in every 20 years for the 14 well sites as outlined in the QRA, and is going to allow it to appropriately regulate and monitor those well sites. I hope you see my point.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yes.
So Co-5D, and this is another well site that is in the Co-5B collection. Co-5D well site was one of the 14 wells compared with Co-5B well site. Co-5D well site, the Co-5 4 well drilled in February 2017, Co-5 5 well drilled in July 2018, and Co-5 6 well drilled in September 2019. This doesn't appear to be representative of drilling workover and drilling operations of every 10 to 20 years as described in the Co-5B well site QRA. There is no, I've made this point before, there's no resource consents and assessment for environmental effects provided to verify what they're able to do on the site. And we have similar concerns for the application of Goldie and Tarangi B well site QRAs. So the safety cases, which I've left in the attachments as well, these refer to major accident hazards for an installation which has the potential to cause 2 or more fatalities at or near the site. These are provided to WorkSafe from Greymouth Petroleum. Well, there's a different purpose for a safety case to meet health and safety regulation rather than land use planning. They're useful for identifying what the major hazards are. The safety cases identify well blowouts as a major accident hazard for well sites, and I've got C, attachment E, F and G. The Tarangi Region Facility Safety Case explicitly identifies aspects of production facilities that are MAHs at Ohanga, Uranui, Onairo, and Republic New Plymouth 4 well sites. The Natoro Region Facility Safety Case is similar with Natoro A and Surrey well sites. This describes such things as, but not limited to, explosions in heaters, overpressure of wellhead, gas breakthroughs, and overpressure of compressor fuel gas train components. It doesn't appear that these are addressed by the detailed QRAs for these well sites. There are some missing well sites. I'm sure that people are aware that they're there, but whether or not they feel that they have been superseded. But Republic New Plymouth 4 well site is referenced in the Turangi Works safety case. The Mokoroa well site, previously mentioned at paragraph 9, has a land use consent in the S142 protection on the discharge consents. Surrey well site, which is referenced in the Natura Works safety case, Appendix G, and is referred to by the T Regional Council, and the main one well site referred to by the Regional Council. The non-standard wells, it's not clear how it's determined that well sites without pipelines have 20 metres separation distance for pipe bores. Without viewing the documentation, existing land use right and existing resource consents that describe what activities are allowed for that site as to how many wells and obviously equipment. And I've just got a couple of examples here. We have Chimero 3 well was drilled at Chimero 3 well site. 1990, it's identified as an oil well at Shutton. The well site could potentially be developed in the future by Greymouth Petroleum based on existing land use rights or existing resource consents. The other ones that they mentioned, Chimero Hay well site has 2 there. They were drilled in 97 and 98. One suspended, one shut in. Again, resource consents could allow for this to be developed in the future using the same existing consent. Windsor 1, 2, 3A wells are shut in, and when Windsor 3 is plugged and abandoned, these wells were drilled in 2000 and could potentially be developed in the future without a new resource consent being required. The water injection well sites are identified as Chimero J, O, and Salisbury well sites. They have 0 metres identified as separation distance. These sites potentially have current resource consents that continue to allow Greymouth Petroleum to continue to drill for oil and gas. And I've provided you an example of Salisbury well site, which has a current resource consent for 5 wells with no expiry date. And then finally, the new permit, which is 60749. There are 4 well sites that have already been drilled in that area. And we noted this in the South Taranaki, that there was a potential, and it occurred, where operators could go back to an existing resource consent that was granted by another company and pick it up and use it. And we believe that this needs to be considered as well. So that was extremely through. Sorry,
Thank you, Sarah.
that's all right. I just wanted to provide some context
Yes,
for the community.
yes. Look, I think we're suggesting that some of these, you talk about non-standard well sites and wells drilled a long time ago, that's able to be redeveloped without resource consents.
No, not without resource consents. The resource consents don't have an expiry date. Hamish would be familiar with this, of what occurred.
Could you ask Ms. Hazen to address me on this?
Oh,
Because,
okay. Yep.
you know, actually understanding, you know, you're making quite a number of these comments here, but we'd want to be satisfied that those resource consents that are held to provide sorts of things that.
For people to put what we call piggyback up off them, is that what?
Yeah, or they can be, you know, land use consents don't have expiry dates, but how they'd work in the future, just, yeah, I'd be interested in some more clarity about that. Ms. Hayes is probably the best one to explain it to me.
I guess Hamish was familiar with it because we experienced a lot of it in South Taranaki as well. Yeah. So I'm happy to ask Ruby, but
Yeah, Hamish, tell us what you know.
So in terms of a land use consent, and looking at Mr. Stenner in the back row, there, he's probably more familiar than I am with the resource consents in the Plymouth district. But for land use consent, you're quite right. If a operator acquires a business or acquires an interest in the resource consent, they take over that land use consent effectively, and the new operator would need to operate in accordance with the parameters of that consent. So that's how I understand it. That same principle applies here in New Plymouth for the petroleum well sites as well. One area I understand, based on what Ms. Roberts just referred to, maybe a difference between historic practice in New Plymouth and South Taranaki is, in South Taranaki, the resource consent specified the number of wells or wellheads that could be drilled, where in New Plymouth, historic practice didn't necessarily, not all the resource consents I understand specified the number of wells that could be drilled under a resource consent. It was just a consent for a well site, then subject to the conditions. So provided you were complying with the conditions of that consent, you could drill further well sites. And so under the proposed plan provisions, there's the key rule in terms of risk management contours is it permits additions and alterations to a well site if the new risk contour doesn't exceed the risk management contour shown in the district plan. So I think that's the key,
So
that's
it's
the
key.
key significance.
Future protection.
Yeah, in terms of what future resource consents may be required, even if they hold current resource consents, they may be permitted under the proposed district plan to drill more if they comply with the risk management contour.
Thank you for that clarification. And again, if you wanted to expand on that, that would be good.
Is it useful to Greymouth and to the hearing to give you the full set of quantitative risk assessment? Is that helpful?
Look, I think, do you have it electronically? I think send that through, particularly the colour plans and also the attachments through to Julie. We'll get that circulated because I think that's before us and we thanks, Sarah. Okay, so I've followed your evidence and I've got a couple of prompting questions to risk experts for the three. So don't have any particular questions for you, Sarah, but shall we hear from Jenny now?
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
I'll just turn my video on. Hi, everyone.
Hello, Jenny. How are you?
Not too bad. How was?
We're I think we're doing okay with our sound. I think have you been able to follow the discussion okay?
Yep, generally it's been fine. There's been the odd patch, but I'll say if I can't hear.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So you have a statement of evidence which I've read through. And maybe if you know the ball's in your court, but if you want to perhaps summarise your main points.
Yes, I think so. And yep. So I won't read it out, but I'll just perhaps look, I'll just state with saying, like, I haven't really seen much detail on this, so it is actually quite difficult for me to express an opinion. So I suppose I would couch this in terms of comments on what I've seen. And I can just perhaps go back to South Taranaki and just summarise that the starting point for South Taranaki was the oil companies in the form of PPANs saying that 50 metres was the worst case consequence. Basically, what it boiled down to is their own information, all of their QRAs, their own consequence. Some of the stuff they'd already tabled showed consequence distances of out to 250 metres from well sites. So the RIMO QRA that Sarah refers to was the one that was used as the envelope of effects for fatality effects for well sites in South Taranaki. So that's where it came from. Just perhaps getting to your point about the differences between South Taranaki and New Plymouth. Difficult for me to make any comment on that, but the factors that would come into play would be the reservoir characteristics, the production rates, the size of the wells, that sort of things may well mean that the effects of an abnormal incident type scenario like a well blowout or whatever it might be may be different in New Plymouth, possibly, but there's, you know, I can't really express an opinion on that because I haven't really seen any detail, but that could explain a difference. So basically the consequence is affected by the production characteristics. It's not affected by the frequency of the activity or the amount of activity that you do. So in some ways it's much, well, it's hard enough to do a generic consequence approach, but because you really only need to take into account the consequence, not the number of activities or the amount of equipment. So if you want to do a generic risk approach, which I completely accept is reasonable and can work when you've got very repeatable layouts and repeatable operating conditions, repeatable throughputs, number of activities, you know, that's not unreasonable. But if you are going to do that, what you have to do from a planning point of view is establish, generally is you want to try and establish the envelope of effects. So that tends to mean that you need to use, from a frequency point of view, which is the other component of risk apart from consequence, the highest number of operations, the most activities, the highest throughputs, the most equipment, that sort of thing, because that will give you the highest frequency. So if you have one drilling activity a year in the same well, you'll have perhaps the same potential adverse consequences any other drilling activity. But if you do 100 drilling activities, obviously the likelihood of some kind of incident is higher and the risk is hence higher. So I guess the main thing that it was quite difficult to establish from the material that was given to me to look at was that the maximum, I suppose, number of activities and maximum extent of equipment was used as the basis for those three generic cases. It was very, very difficult to see that that was the case. Now, there's been lots of statements that, oh, yes, it's reasonably conservative, but generally speaking, from when we do risk for planning purposes, you look at the envelope of what's allowed, not necessarily what is being done at a particular time, and that you want to look at the risk for the extent of approved or allowed activities. And so that generally means that in New Zealand, it's a resource content. In Australia, it's other things. In other countries, it's different again. But generally speaking, there's some kind of definition around what's allowed in terms of throughputs, the amount of equipment, how it's laid out, how many activities you can do per year. So that kind of information, it was certainly not really evident in the information that was provided, how the different well sites have been allocated into those buckets, or in fact that the particular representative example was actually the envelope of effects for that type of well site.
Yep.
It's not to say that it wasn't, but it's just that it is quite difficult to see that, as you made the point about having a representative sample. So typically if you do these things, there is some kind of, and maybe this has been done, but I certainly haven't seen it. You do go through the parameters that have an effect and work out which is the worst combination of those and pick that one. And it just is not evident from what's there that is what's been done. So really that's my main point, is it's quite difficult to transfer, well, from the information I've seen, that those generic QRAs are actually at the upper limit of each bucket. So that really is it in a nutshell. Like, risk is consequence times frequency. I completely accept that 250 may be too conservative for New Plymouth. That may well be the case. You can establish that just by doing consequence modelling, which is a lot simpler than doing a whole QRA. If you want to do the generic QRA, the work is actually, there's more work probably in putting in buckets than doing the generic QRAs. And that work may well have been done, but it's not evident in the material that's been provided. And there's very little in Mr. Dreher's evidence about how they've handled the frequency aspect of the risk assessments. So really, that is my main point, that it's difficult to see that the QRAs match up with what the consented or allowable maximum extent of activity is for all of the well sites. So pretty much that's it.
Yep, you know, I really, I have followed that, and just you coming on to explain that after Sarah's evidence is helpful. I did have a couple of questions that I'd invite you to comment, and also Lachlan. I wonder, Lachlan, if you could come on screen as well. What we call a mini hot tub. I don't know whether you've ever hot tub before in these hearings. It's a funny old term, but this is quite helpful, and we've got Sarah. other
Many
Sarah
times
going
in
around
South
as well.
Taranaki.
Yeah, yeah. So
We're a friendly bunch.
yes. So I'd like your comments from the three risk experts here, just on a couple of questions. The first one really bounces off the questions I was asking Phil Roberts here about the three well sites that the detailed assessments have been prepared for, and we got Jason sort of quite helpfully said there was a range, a low production one perhaps, and this is where I understand the commercial sensitivity is, because you don't want to release,
It almost, yeah, saying that out loud.
give it away, yes, but
Don't need the
it's
actual
really the
number.
trust of the risk experts that there is a good representative range of inputs to cover the envelope of potential effects from a range of well sites to generate a data set that can be applied more broadly over a range of other wells. So in essence, is that the problem you have? I'll start with you, Jenny, that you just don't know?
Yeah, it's
The
very
details of what the,
yeah.
Yeah.
So perhaps there's some qualitative type statements that you could make that would say something along the lines of, the highest pressure well with the highest gas flow rate, with the biggest production capacity, the largest, that kind of thing is, even if you don't know the numbers, say that is the basis for assessing all the wells, for example. Okay. And then same thing with, I think you said that you've done actually a specific QRA for all the things with a production station or production equipment. So there's no need to be generic about production stations. Was that what I interpreted that? So this is purely about well sites. Yep. Okay. So, you can make some statements about the things that affect consequence, and that's primarily, I guess, pressure and capacity of the well, I guess, would be, and perhaps composition would be the three things, the main things. Lachlan, feel free to step in if you don't think I've got it, but probably they're the main.
Look, yeah, certainly we could do that in those three sites that we did the detailed analysis on. We had a lot of discussions with Jason, stepping through to identify what gives us good representative cross section of what the Greymouth wells look like, and so that's where we landed with those three, and hence we did the analysis on those. It's probably a question for Jason if there's one slightly outside the envelope, but I don't. From all the discussions we'd had, they've got it covered within the degree of variation that is significant to a QRA. So quite comfortable with that. Easy enough to make such a statement, but Jason could certainly confirm it for us, but for QRA purposes.
Yeah. So that's one aspect from a consequence point of view. So that kind of is not really that's not risk, that's just consequence. So that would probably say, oh, well, the maximum consequence footprint from a well site is whatever it is, or our three upper limit representative well sites is whatever it is. I don't know what it is, but whatever it is. And then from a risk point of view, this is where it gets obviously a little bit more tricky, because it's...
To be honest, I don't think it does, because it can only go so far.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
You're stacking it up on top of each other.
I completely
and
understand that.
it stays here. So
Yeah,
it can't go any
completely,
further.
yeah.
So
So why not use the envelope of the worst case consequence?
So
It'd
it
be
can-
so much more straightforward and much less difficult to justify.
to be honest,
however,
that's where we started
Yeah.
back at the earlier hearing.
yeah,
yes,
and that may, and to me, that's obviously a much more transparent and easier way to do this. As soon as you introduce risk, you do have to start saying, okay, well, I've got this many activities, how many drilling activity, so it obviously, as I say in my evidence, and as everyone knows, the risk cannot go outside the maximum consequence footprint, obviously not. But if there's one piece of equipment and one drilling activity, obviously the contour will be in a different place to if you have 100 or 10. Still not going to be outside
limited, but it's limited, and given
to the
nature of,
consequence.
And given the nature of these facilities, it's limited to, and what
Yeah.
we've put forward in the as in terms of proposed distances where we didn't do the detailed models. You asked the question about how we go about it. Well, basically, we had a look at the individual sites that we were making the estimates for, and go, right, what do we know about those sites? What have we got in terms of wells? What nature of wells? What other facilities have we got there? What equipment? What does that look like when we compare that to the hazardous events from the analysis we've done? We go, right, these are the big ones. These are the big events. Your risk con, based on everything we know, your risk con will go like about here,
Yeah.
and then add a bit.
Look, Lachlan, I completely understand all that,
Can I just?
but that's not
can I
evident
just ask
from
you-
the evidence. I've looked
Jenny,
at.
Jenny,
It is
Jenny, can I
described
just ask?
actually, to be honest.
Look,
Sorry.
okay, I'm running the show, so.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
Step a bit.
yeah, it sounds like, I'm trying to. Lachlan,
Yep.
when you looked at these well sites, the question of potential, did you actually look at actual wells on these sites as of today, or the potential that they could go to under current resource consent rights?
We asked the question to Greymouth. Like, no, I didn't go and look up all the resource consents. That's not my job. We asked the question to Greymouth, what's the number of wells that we should base this on? And that we then put that into the model. But like, as I say,
Yes.
So there's 2 wells on Goldie,
Mm.
and the sites that Goldie's been compared to have 2 wells or less, and consented for that. Co-5 B has a consent for up to 8 wells. The sites compared to Co-5 B, the maximum number of wells consented is 8. Turingi B, we've done the QRA for 24 wells. We're in the process of lodging a variation. It's currently consented for 8 wells. We're in the process of lodging a variation for up to 24 wells. So Turingi B, QRA 24 wells, and that's the sites compared to Turingi B, the maximum consented is 8. So there's an overestimate on Turingi B, so it's slightly more conservative, but Lachlan has said that the number of wells doesn't actually affect the contour.
and
You can see.
Yeah, but look, just to follow, just so we've got actually evidence in front of us, it would be really helpful if you could give us a table of those 3 sites in terms of the resource consents, limitations on size, and confirm that what's actually been given to Lachlan to base his assessment of these 3 representative wells. I think that's not on evidence. I'm not sure, Lachlan, whether you've provided that in the hearing 12 evidence or anywhere else.
I'd have to check the detail as to if those specific numbers are in there. But one of the things, one point I'd like to make, when we do that, make that comparison, we're not saying that this well site is exactly like that one. It's that the key risk contributors match up and so on. So there is different aspects. So it's not appropriate to look at it and go, oh, let's say there's 4 wells on this one of the other sites we've looked at, and we've matched it up against this another one, and it's got a different number of wells. If that's not a appropriate dots to join. What we're looking at is what are the major risk contributor events, what are the impacts of those, and how does that then play out? And then we come to a conclusion. And to be honest, we've then added the layer of conservatism that makes us very comfortable that what we proposed in those risk management distances for the remaining wells has it well and truly covered. And I have a couple in my back pocket that demonstrate that to us very comfortably.
Okay, so in the back pocket, so this is where it comes down to what we can deal with in any joint witness statements. Well, I've heard that whether you have 4 wells sitting on a perhaps an area that hasn't been that successful, low producing, low pressure, that's quite different to my mind anyway from a high pressure well, really productive. So whether you've got 4 wells versus 4 wells, that's not the right comparison, is it? You've got to have this other information about scale of resource, pressures, those sorts of things. So is that what is commercially sensitive, Jason? And that's what makes us
Sorry.
Oh, pressures.
flow rates for the operators. So that's as I understand it. Lachlan, you got your hand up, just.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to get back one. We're getting hung up on this whole frequency thing, and I think my view is it is an issue, as Jennifer says, but it's not actually that significant in the grand scheme of things in the risk profile. If you look at where we've identified the 5 by 10 to the -7 risk contour and the 1 by 10 to the -6 risk contour, that's a factor of 2. So you could think of it the other way, that the difference between those two is could be basically doubling or halving whichever way you're going, the activity on the facility. So you can see there's not a lot of difference in those.
Can you see that, or does Jenny have the same information?
Well, I
Uh,
can't see that because I have no information on frequency.
Well,
or
I
differences
think,
between
but
competencies.
you have the earlier evidence that had the QRA that had the multiple risk contours in it.
Yeah, no, I have no argument about the 5 times 10 to the -7 because it's a flammable site and the difference in footprint is
No,
very,
no,
very
I'm talking about the difference between, because we're talking about frequency. I'm talking about
Yeah.
the difference between the location of the 5 by 10 to the -7 and the 1 by 10 to the
Lachlan, I
-6.
understand. But if you have
Are they
10
close?
drilling activities, just very simply, say you have a consequence distance of 100 meters
Hmm.
at a risk at 100 meters of 1 times 10 to the -6. Yeah, if you've got 10 of those activities, it's going to be 10 times 10 to the
We know
-6.
that. We know that. We know that.
Yeah, we know that. So frequency
If
is
I-
relevant in
Yes,
this.
no, it is relevant. But if I double, if to take your point, you want to see an exact example of it, double the activities on the QRA that we had
But you're
previously
missing my
presented.
point.
No, you are missing
So,
mine.
so look, listen, guys, I think
Mm.
this isn't working too well.
No.
Um,
Sorry, Lachlan.
And Sarah, I'd
Sorry.
like your opinion because I am minded to direct some joint witness conferencing on this matter. And what I've heard in the evidence today, that there's perhaps some issues around availability to do this within timeframes. But I would have thought that in terms of the evidence we have in place, we could couch some key questions that were going to help us with our decision making. Put those down and have the 3 experts really give us their advice and reasoning. If they agree on a particular question or point, let's get it recorded in the JWS. They don't agree, the reasons they don't agree. And it sounds like there might be sort of 3 or 4 key questions of disagreement. Does that sound a reasonable approach, Sarah?
It's only clarity, I think, or Jenny too, is obviously addressing the other issue around the information and redacted information and the commercial sensitivity.
Yes.
At the moment, Jenny hasn't got the QRAs.
Yes.
Yeah, and the QRAs I have show that they don't match the resources consents, the ones that I have, which I've said no. Hence, the frequencies may be wrong. It may not make a material difference. It may.
I think, Jenny, I am going to rely on, we agree after this discussion on Thursday, on confidentiality, on Hamish and Sarah to convene JWS, I think, with some questions that we can agree around the parties. And the key missing thing is what information can be made available that's going to be helpful for that. And that comes back to the confidentiality question that Ruby raised and we talked a bit with Karen about, and we'll come back to that on Thursday morning. But just in principle, if we do decide to go down the path, I'll need to talk with David and also Antoine, who was on the hearing 12 and all about this. But in terms of availability to do this, is it a 2-week window you'd need or what?
Jenny had the restriction.
No, she didn't have the restriction. We resolved the issues.
I think that sequencing and timing in terms of, to be fair to Jenny, to
Yes.
receive the information in
Yes.
terms of the QRAs, they're not short documents,
Yes.
to review, read them, and then to be able to be in an informed position to discuss with Sarah and Lachlan So
Jenny.
Jenny.
Karen's point was, is Jenny's role to ensure that the Becker review was suitable? Or is Jenny's role to remodel is pertinent and so I guess that's a consideration.
Should we talk about that with the council, what the roles are? It's,
Can I just add something to, we actually asked quite early on to be part of this, so that when the model was going to be developed, we were part of it. And there was no response from the commissioners around that. And so it wasn't until I was contacted by Hamish and it had already progressed to a point where we were now at this position.
I'm not sure seeing anything.
TW memo dated 16th of December. I followed it up and I was assured it was put in front of the commissioners, but we didn't have any response. So I decided that maybe we weren't going to get any response. And it would, yeah. So
Again, that would be around the time that hearing 12 was, so if you did respond there, can you send the email
can I send those responses to you?
to Julie?
Can you put it in my-
It's part of the hearing 12 response from Taranaki Energy Watch
Okay,
after the hearing from memory.
okay. And that was that requesting some action from the commissioners?
Regarding next steps
Next step,
Or bringing in
and
a-
additional information.
but as far as you haven't heard anything back,
we didn't hear anything back.
let's find that. And I think,
I'm just thinking in terms of where we're at now. And we're reconvening on Thursday with Hazen's presence.
yes,
Would it be helpful if Ms. Shepherd and I, by Thursday, circulate some draft questions
Yes.
for conferencing
yes,
to the parties?
yes.
And if the parties can confirm the availability of the experts within the next fortnight, and just see if we can line things up when we come together on Thursday morning.
Yes,
Just one other technicality, we're going to include Jason as an expert just because he's got the knowledge of all of our well sites in terms of pressures and that which we put through Hamish, is it?
yes,
He wouldn't be an independent expert in terms of the environment court practice, no,
yes.
but he has an intimate understanding of the Greymouth operations, which would inform the 3 independent risk experts.
Jason, you've provided evidence
Mhm.
in the hearing as an expert, not as an expert, as a company person. Yeah, this is always an issue about whether company people should be in expert conferencing. I suppose my own view is that if that role is recognised as a resource for the experts and not as someone that would sign off the witness statements and point of view, I think that can be quite helpful.
That was my understanding of Jason's role.
Right, well, I think let's do that. If you can work before Thursday. And also, we haven't got Ruby's submissions yet, so they normally come in the day before. And she can address some of the questions I've asked you, but also I'd like to understand the confidentiality issue and whether we can put any rules around information or not. It's always very difficult. We can receive information confidentially as commissioners, but if that can't be extended to the other experts, that we'll just have to understand that why.
Email. So, from what Greymouth stipulated in terms of the confidentiality, what would be acceptable to them as a company. So I expect that will be the starting point.
That one was two well site QRAs redacted. That was all. And what we raised was we couldn't understand if Sarah had access to it as expert for the council, why our version was redacted.
Sarah, you've seen the QRAs, yeah?
Yes.
the rules and evidence, to my mind, if everyone's equal around the table as experts, council brings its own experts to the table and we treat you as the same level of experts. So that's the topic of conversation. We're being Karen on Thursday as well, in terms of the council to see information and not the same subject. Now, I would like to find out about there's probably some reasons why perhaps it hasn't been progressed. Discussion. It's been a long day and I certainly appreciate everyone's attendance, but if there's any further comments, Jenny and Lachlan, look, I think, you know, I was getting a bit lost between the experts speak. I'm used to listening to landscape architects and ecologists speaking tongues, but yeah, I'm certainly getting the gist of this, but let's just take a breath and we'll come back together on Thursday morning. Does that sound all right? Thank you. Okay. Well, at 5:25, we'll adjourn the hearing, this particular hearing, until Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.